Good morning. Anybody in here remember the movie Urban Cowboy? That one goes way back. Way back. Some of you weren't even born yet. But 1980 movie Urban Cowboy, and Johnny Lee's number one hit out of that movie, Living on Love, or Looking for Love, became a really popular song all across the country. And that song, of course, became famous for the idea of looking for love in all the wrong places. That's a line out of that. The Apostle John might say we've been looking for bread in all of the wrong places. And have you ever noticed, no matter how good your last meal was, eventually you're hungry again? Somebody mentioned barbecue yesterday, a new barbecue place in town, and I've had barbecue on my mind for 20 hours, Rick. No matter how good your last meal was, eventually you're hungry again. And that's true of everything in our life. It's true of things like achievement. It's true of things like pleasure. It's true of everything we spend our lives chasing. We fill ourselves again and again only to discover that we always end up hungry. So we're in John chapter 6 this morning. Second of a short 3-week arc here, looking at the miracles of Jesus. And the first 14 verses here of John chapter 6, this is a very familiar story to most of us, I'm assuming. It's one of the accounts of Jesus feeding the 5,000 people. And as we are going to see, we call these miracles, John doesn't. John calls it a sign. And I think that distinction is really important because today I think in kind of our modern scientific world, we think about a miracle, and what we're usually interested in asking is how? How did Jesus do this? We want the quantum physics behind it. But a sign, this is what John calls these things, a sign points to the message underneath the activity. It invites us to ask why, not how. Because the real question in this story isn't how Jesus filled empty stomachs the way he did. It's really why people with full stomachs were still hungry. When you look at the full chapter, there's something underneath of this. So we're going to dive in. I'm not going to read this verse by verse, but we're going to walk through the story. So if you have it open in front of you, we're just going to start at the beginning and go to the end. So here's the setting. Jesus and his disciples have crossed to the far side of the Sea of Galilee. They're in the northern part of the country, but they aren't alone, of course. This is so often the case when they're on the move. A great crowd has been following them because they have been seeing these signs that Jesus has already been doing. We looked last week at the very first sign, the wine at the wedding in Cana. So the word is getting around, the crowd is following. Everywhere Jesus goes, the crowds get bigger and bigger. Paparazzi isn't a new thing. And so here in this particular episode, they've crossed the sea. Jesus has walked up to the side of a mountain, a hill up on top, and he and his disciples are sitting down, and he looks up and he sees, here comes the crowd again. We can't get away from them. And the people just keep coming. Thousands of people before long are spread all across this hillside. Jesus turns to Philip. How'd you like to be the guy he picked out of the bunch? Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Now, Lizzie has been asking me all morning, where are we going for lunch? I got 7 people to worry about. Jesus turns to Philip. Where are we going to buy bread? And I can just see Philip kind of look around going, what kind of question is that? We're miles from everywhere. What do you mean buy bread? There's nowhere to buy bread. It is a strange question. But then John immediately pulls back the curtain on what's happening here. Okay? And he says Jesus already knows exactly what he's going to do, but he asks the question to Philip for a reason. Because this question isn't really about bread. He wasn't searching for information. He didn't need to know the answer. John says he says it to test Philip. And we can understand it's not just Philip, it's the disciples. And we can understand it's not just the disciples, it's us. This isn't a pop quiz about bread. It's a window into Philip's heart and mind. So here we are, Philip, thousands of people. How are we going to feed them? Now maybe Philip was maybe he was the operational strategist in the bunch. Maybe that's why Jesus picked him. I don't know. We're not told. But faced with this question, faced with this problem of need, I love what Philip does in a way. He does what I think most of us would do. He starts doing the math. Well, I'm going to go back to my knowledge bank. I'm getting my calculator out. I think I can figure this out maybe. So I'm counting the people. We're going to estimate the cost. I don't know if they had Apple Watches with calculators, so maybe he pulled an abacus out of his cloak, right? Because he ran the numbers. That's exactly what the text says. And he comes back and he says, 200 denarii, master. That wouldn't even scratch the surface. 200 denarii, half a year's wages. So let's say we're a little bit of a higher end scale community. Let's say $50,000. If we had $50,000, that would just give everybody a bite. This is a massive crowd. Like Philip's done the math. The numbers are right. The answer is way too obvious. There isn't any food here. We don't have a way to do this. Philip spent time thinking about this. I'm going to go up in here and solve the problem. And Philip's instinct isn't at all unusual. I think this is the human thing to do. I think this is what we all do. This is why it's a test. It's how we live, isn't it? We stop and think about it. We quietly build our lives around the things we believe can sustain us. We do the math. We calculate. We look at what we have. We build careers and financial security. We build routines and friendships. We build comfortable lives. We even build our spiritual habits. We all do. And none of that's wrong. God made us that way. But at some level, our life begins to be like this. We keep gathering bread. And so recognize right here at the outset, I don't think I need to say this, but just to help us be clear, bread's a metaphor. Okay? We keep gathering bread, hoping that if we have enough of it, we will never be hungry. Hungry is a metaphor down here. So here's Jesus with his disciples confronting this moment of great physical hunger, because indeed it was. This crowd was in fact hungry. So like he used the wine that ran out at the party to teach an impactful lesson here too, he will do the same thing. He's about to teach this. So Philip he's checked the bank account. It's not going to work. We don't got the budget. Jesus, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. Andrew, he's the next guy in line apparently. He decides to check the pantry. Well, somebody in this crowd is going to have some food. So he starts out on the hunt looking for the food. Surely somebody here brought snacks. Now, Jonathan told me when he was helping us get ready to go to Truist Park for a ball game several weeks ago, I learned Jonathan likes to take a big bag of Low Country boil into the Braves games. Well, I want to now, okay? Andrew's walking around the stadium looking for the guys who brought the Low Country boil into the game. Somebody brought food to this thing, but nothing. And then, of course, we know the story. Somebody notices this boy. Well, here, the only food in the park, just this kid over here, he's got a little bit of food. He's got a little bit of lunch, his mama. Aren't you glad there's one mom in the whole bunch that thought ahead? Here's a little boy with his lunch. But it's kind of like, maybe I can envision it this way. Maybe you're hosting a party, just a spontaneous party. All your friends came over. You weren't really prepared for that. You got some food. Maybe you ordered pizzas. It's not stretching far enough. And so you tell a friend, Go see if we got anything left in the kitchen. And so they go in there, they open every cabinet, they're pulling open the refrigerator, they're pulling open the freezer, the pantry. Finally, they call back and say, all I found is a half a sleeve of saltine crackers and a can of stale peaches. Like, that's not dinner. That's simply proof you're out of food. I mean, that's what this detail is here with the boy and his lunch. This isn't Andrew coming up and saying, oh, hey, Jesus, I got an idea. This will work. Are you serious? No. It's the equivalent of going, there ain't nothing left in the pantry. We have turned it up. This is all there is. And John is never gives us details accidentally. John tells us a couple of things that are very, very important information for us. He tells us the boy's holding fish and barley loaves. Now, you would have to know the context here. This isn't immediately in the passage itself, but we are in northern Galilee. This is fishing and agriculture country. This is the blue-collar neighborhood of Israel. These are low-income people, relatively speaking. And the detail of the boy bringing fish and barley is telling us a great deal about the economics of the crowd. It's poverty, near poverty, lower class. The bread, the barley, was the bread of the lower classes because it was easy to grind quickly, made a rough, coarse textured bread. Wheat bread required a great deal more refining, and its processing was more expensive. And the fish was something they just caught right out of the lake, Galilean lake, and would have dried in their backyard. Okay, so the idea of poverty is wrapped into this. Now, without knowing those details about the cultural setting, we wouldn't normally catch it. But this is very intentional. Okay, we are dealing with an impoverished type of a situation. There is nothing. The people had nothing. Philip has searched the bank account, it's empty. Andrew has searched the pantry, it's empty. And all along, that's exactly where Jesus has been leading them to this moment. He isn't trying to solve the problem of them wanting something to eat at lunch. That's what they think the problem is. He's trying to expose a much, much deeper problem. He's trying to expose and help the disciples begin to see and help us begin to understand and see for ourselves the poverty of every way we have learned and tried to provide for ourselves in life. No matter how much we think we have, anything we bring and anything we do to fill ourselves up is impoverished, is poor. So Jesus says simply to them, have everybody sit down. No spectacle, no drama. And he just gladly takes this little boy's lunch. And I would like to think, we're not told how the encounter takes place, right? We simply know the boy has a lunch, and the next thing we know, Jesus has it. So I would like to think, go with me on this, I think it's a reasonable interpretation. I would like to think they didn't hit the boy in the head and take it from him. Am I on safe ground here exegetically to do this? Okay. One has to suppose the boy was a willing participant. So here he is, he receives this little boy's lunch. I mean, barely enough to feed the kid, meager though it is. And in his hands, Jesus gives thanks. And right here is where everything changes. Remember, bread's a metaphor. Because now the bread from the poor boy is in the hands of the one who delights to give. And he breaks the bread. And the disciples begin passing it out. And they keep passing it out. And they keep passing. Can you imagine being in that hillside that day? Watching this? We want to say, how did he do it? John is saying, why did he do it? And this goes on thousands. Now, the number we're given is 5,000, but all biblical scholars are pretty confident because of the way that the Greco-Roman world counted, it would have been 5,000 men. So double that easily. Perhaps quite a bit more. Okay? Lots and lots. So it spreads and spreads. Everyone eats as much as they wanted. It's like going to the all-you-can-eat dinner buffet. My daddy used to say, if you leave here hungry, it's your fault. And of course, then John gives us one more detail. The disciples, Jesus tells them, go gather up the leftovers. And John notes they gathered 12 baskets. Now, that's a detail that's important. That's for another sermon, not here. But did you watch carefully? Do you see it? The miracle doesn't begin when the bread multiplies. The sign begins the moment the bread is surrendered. The miracle begins the moment the meal is surrendered. Don't miss that sign, folks. Bread, our bread, it satisfies us, but only for a while. Whatever it is we have looked to fill our lives, it may work for a while, but tomorrow you'll be hungry again. Tomorrow you'll be hungry again, because this miracle, this sign, it isn't ultimately pointing to the bread. It's pointing to the one who is holding it, because there's a fullness in our lives, and there's a fullness in our spirit that only Jesus can give. And he's ready to give it to every one of us this morning. You see, that's where surrender brings us, like the little boy. I got nothing. Not really. But you can have it. That's where surrender brings us, but that's where grace begins. That's where the work begins. Not because of what the boy had to give. That's really rather inconsequential here in the long run. But because all he had was placed into the hands of Jesus. Is all you have placed into the hands of Jesus this morning? Do you recognize? Do I recognize, do we recognize whatever it is we're holding on to is as unable to fill us as that little boy's fish and loaves was able to feed a crowd? But Jesus offers us something so much better. But the story's not done. So the people see this taking place and they're amazed. But again, look at their reaction. They're not going, how did he do that? Look at what they say. Verse 14. Immediately, surely, this is the prophet who is to come into this world. Why did they say that? How did they go from seeing that bread to this very specific label, this is the prophet? Because they had been waiting for this their whole lives. Let me explain this. The people on that hillside, they knew stories. They knew stories from the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. They called the Scriptures. They had seen, and this was deeply rooted in Jewish history and Jewish life, going all the way back to the account of the Exodus. When Israel couldn't feed itself in the Exodus, what did God do? The miracle of manna from heaven, the miracle of the quail coming down. This idea of abundance, so much manna, so much quail, the people got sick of it. God gave them bread from heaven. The story of Elijah when he's fleeing with the threats of death on his life, and he flees into the wilderness to hide. And week after week, God brings bread to Elijah with the ravens flying it in, God delivering an abundance of bread. The story in 2 Kings with Elisha, who finds himself in need and has 20 loaves of bread brought to him, and he breaks the bread and multiplies it to feed a crowd of 100 men. Very familiar story. The Jewish people in that crowd knew all of these stories But they weren't just stories anymore to them. This had become the expectation by this point in Jewish history when Jesus shows up. It had begun building. And many Jews now had begun to recognize and had been told over and over again that when the Messiah comes, he will lead a new exodus. The signs of the Messiah will look like the signs of the Exodus. And Jewish writings, one very well-known book that was written probably not too long before Jesus was born, called Second Baruch. It's not in our Bible, but it was an influential book for the Jewish people at the time. Second Baruch spoke very specifically of a coming day when the Messiah would provide bread from heaven. And he would do it in such a way that the miracle would look even bigger than manna in the wilderness in Moses' time. And so the rabbis, for 2 generations, had taken these stories and had begun to reflect and teach and promise the Messiah is going to be one who brings bread from heaven. So can you imagine, with that in your backdrop, out on the hillside, Jesus takes little barley loaves. And he takes these fish, he begins to break it, they begin to pass it, they begin to realize, what? Wait, what? Do you see this? Wait, could it be? The bells are ringing, and the alarms, the fireworks are going all off in their mind. This is the Messiah. This is the prophet. This is the one we've been talking about all these years. He's now standing right in front of us. Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. You know what? They were right. Jesus is the Messiah. You see, they recognized the sign, as we'll find out in the rest of the Gospels, of course. They misunderstood what the sign was pointing to. You see, they thought the Messiah had come to give them bread of a particular sort that fit their designs on the kind of life they wanted. When in fact the Messiah, Jesus, had come not to give them bread, but to be their bread. And there's a world of difference. No, there's an eternity of difference. Because the very next story that follows here in this feeding of the 5,000, and I preached on it a while back, the whole, what we call the bread of life narrative, when Jesus explains the miracle, and he will go on to say, I am the bread of life. And when you eat of this bread, you will never go hungry again. This bread, Jesus, him, is what always satisfies. But they missed the meaning of the sign. And we have to be honest that we do too. That we often make the same mistake. We spend our lives looking for that bread. We spend our lives looking for the things that will satisfy, that will quiet our anxieties, that will make us feel secure. Money, success, comfort, familiar routines, family rituals. Like I said at the beginning, none of those are bad things. But they don't fill us. Not ultimately. We keep going back and back again and again. There's something more. There's a fullness that Jesus offers. And so what we see in this story, moving to the end here, we see this. Jesus led his disciples into a place of great scarcity. There was the loss of things. They were confronted with needs they no longer knew how to meet. And sooner or later, friends, if we keep following Jesus, and if we're serious about following Jesus, he leads us there too. He will take us to places of great scarcity and emptiness in our own lives and in our own situation, to places where the things we've always depended upon are not enough, or they're not available, or they don't work, And you know why he'll do this to us? It's not because he delights in watching us struggle. It's because he loves us too much to let us keep mistaking ordinary bread for the bread of life. He loves us too much to let us do that. And I wonder this morning if the Holy Spirit is wanting to help us hear something along these lines. Maybe what you've been calling disappointment, maybe what you've been calling frustration or anxiety, maybe what you've been calling loss, maybe what you've been experiencing as restlessness. Maybe it's really a deeper hunger. And maybe this morning you are hungry in that way. And maybe it's been a long, long time since you've tasted the bread of life that can fully satisfy. Or maybe you never have, not truly. Kurt Vonnegut, author, told a story about attending a lavish party in New York with his friend Joseph Heller, the guy who wrote the book Catch-22. So these two authors, they're at this party, and their host was a billionaire who, in a single day, probably made more money than Heller's famous novel would earn in his entire lifetime. So the two guys are at the luncheon. Kurt Vonnegut leans over to, and Kurt Vonnegut's telling the story. Vonnegut leans over to Joseph Heller, and he says, Joe, doesn't it bother you that our host made more money yesterday than your book has made in all of its history? Joseph Heller is very famous at this point. And Vonnegut recalls that Joe Heller smiles and says, no, I've got something he'll never have. Curious, Vonnegut says, what's that, Joe? Enough. Do you have enough? That's what surrender is. And that posture, surely we see in this little boy. It's going to be what we sing about here as we close. Surrender is letting go of the illusion that what you've been living on is enough and admitting that it isn't. It's about releasing what you've been depending upon to fill you and admitting it never could. And here's the best part. Surrender isn't just letting go. When we surrender everything to Jesus, it's making room. It's making room for the one who delights in filling our empty hands when we finally are willing to acknowledge they are empty. Jesus will delight in filling those hands. And he will delight in filling our hearts and lives. So what waits on the other side of surrender? It isn't less. It isn't loss. It's more. It's abundance. It's an overflowing. It's a grace that never runs out. And this overflowing, this abundance, this 12 baskets, it's important here in this sermon for this reason, that when God wants to fill us with the things that only he can do to satisfy us, the result is it flows outward into the lives of other people. Because God's filling us is never just for us. God's filling us is not just to make us comfortable and happy. It's not just to satisfy our hearts. Oh, it does that. But he wants so much more for us. Do you have that filling? Do you know that? You see, this story doesn't turn, and I end with this. So let me ask all of us to close our eyes. We're going to take communion in here in just a minute. But this story doesn't turn because a little boy had enough food to feed the crowd. It turns because, poor though it may have been, to him it was everything. It was his food. There was no other. And the story turns because all he had was placed into the hands of Jesus. Because Jesus is enough. Friends, this morning as we come and take communion, and I hadn't planned this is the way the work schedule worked out, but we are quite literally celebrating this truth that the bread of life is available to us. That the bread of life can fill and meet every need, every desire.